Updates from Europe now. As its vaccination drive reaches a third of adults and COVID-19 infections ease, Europe is starting to reopen cities and beaches, raising hopes that this summer's holiday season can be saved before it is too late. With more than 200 million vaccine doses delivered in the bloc, the European Union is on track to achieve its goal of inoculating 70% of its adult population by summer. Across the EU, the 7-day incidence of COVID-19 is 185 infections. This comes as vaccine deliveries were slow initially in the EU under the bloc's centralised procurement strategy. In Britain, the approval of vaccines and a decision to give first doses to as many people has now driven down infections and related deaths far more quickly. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson set out the next phase of lockdown easing in England, giving the green light to cautious hugging and allowing pubs and restaurants to serve customers. With shots from Pfizer and Moderna relatively plentiful, vaccinations are now growing as a share of the population in Europe, while countries that made early advances see slowdowns. Many nations encounter hesitation among the unvaccinated. Around 31.6% of adults in 30 European countries received their first jab, and 12% of the population have a full two-shot regime. France expects to give 20 million first injections by mid-May, and the country is set to hit 30 million by mid-June. With infection rates falling and occupancy in ICU units declining, France is also relaxing its coronavirus-related restrictions, allowing cafes, bars and restaurants to offer outdoor services from May 19th. Improving the supply has given countries greater freedom to adapt their strategies to the current situation, following reports of blood clotting that it received from AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. Germany has now decided to make the two vaccines available to anyone as long as they have been advised to take it by a doctor. An offer aimed at younger adults who would have to wait for their turn otherwise. Norway's Vaccine Commission made a similar call, saying that the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines will be available to all volunteers. Some Italian regions are also offering both the shots to people under 60 years. With some governments shortening the gaps between doses, people cooped up for months are finally daring to make holiday plans. The European Union is also planning for a digital green pass, that is a scheme in June for travellers to provide proof of vaccination or immunity against the infection. For more on this, we are now being joined by our correspondent Trent Murray from Berlin. Trent, thanks so much for joining us. Could you just walk us through the phased reopening that has begun in many parts of Europe?
Yeah, well, that's right. Europe is taking steps out of lockdown, albeit quite slow steps, as coronavirus infection levels do start to decrease across much of the continent. Here where I am in Berlin, a controversial nighttime curfew has been lifted as the city sees infection levels fall. It means that here in the capital, 3.8 million people will now have the freedom to venture out at nighttime again. Previously, the curfew said they had to stay at home after 10 p.m. unless they had a compelling reason, like caring for an elderly family member or maybe going to and from work. It's part of a phased reopening. That's how authorities are describing it. Other measures that we're seeing today is a lifting of bans on outdoor swimming. It means that a number of city pools have been allowed to reopen again, just in time for the warmer weather, as well as people will be allowed to gather in slightly larger groups now, especially at night time. That was again banned during the curfew. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel as the weather warms up, but Angela Merkel has said Germany is not quite out of the woods yet.
Right, Trent, let's talk about France now, which has reopened cafes and cultural venues after 6 months. The nighttime curfew has also been pushed back. How do you assess a slow return to normalcy, and what can you tell us about the efficacy of the vaccine drive in France?
Yeah, well, I mean, fewer scenes are more synonymous with Paris than people sitting out on those cafe terraces, having a coffee, reading the newspaper, maybe having a debate about politics with each other. And that is back as of today in the City of Lights. Cafes, restaurants, terraces, all allowed to reopen to patrons again as coronavirus levels do start to fall across France. There is still a curfew in place in Paris. People will have to try and get home by 9 p.m. But French President Emmanuel Macron is optimistic that France has seen the worst of the COVID pandemic. He, of course, was pictured himself out enjoying a coffee this morning, no doubt trying to give some hope and encouragement to people in the capital to leave home confinement, to come out, support small businesses. It does come as the vaccine campaign does really accelerate in Europe. I mean, here in Germany, we've just seen in the last hour, almost 850,000 vaccines were given yesterday. It now means that about 38% of the population has received at least one dose. Obviously still some way to go, but it seems that those numbers, both infection levels and vaccines, are heading in the right direction.
Right, Trent, since you mentioned Germany, now the country will also remove the priority limits on who can receive a coronavirus vaccine from June the 7th. But the vaccine supply is still limited in Germany, so how will the country tackle the same?
Yeah, well, there is growing hope now that those shipments from vaccine manufacturers will continue to increase, and that has led to some growing confidence among lawmakers to start lifting restrictions on the vaccine priority list. As like most countries, Germany has prioritised getting vaccines to the elderly as well as front care health workers, but from early June that priority list will be scrapped, and everyone over the age of 18 will be able to book a vaccine. Now, there is some tempering of expectations here. The health minister has said not everyone will be able to get a vaccine straight away in June, but he is confident they will be able to book an appointment. Germany relying very heavily on vaccines from Pfizer and BioNTech, AstraZeneca, as well as Moderna from the United States. So there is hope that those shipments will continue, and with it, so too will the vaccine campaign as well as the inoculation rate.
Right, my final question for you, Trent. Now that Europe is on the path of reopening, what can you tell us about the travel restrictions and the opening up of borders? Also, there are plans of the EU reopening borders to those who are fully vaccinated.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of countries in Europe rely so heavily on tourism for their economy, and so many of them are very keen to reopen. Again, we've seen this week Greece has started to welcome tourists back. They are asking people to either come with a certificate showing that they have been fully vaccinated. If they haven't yet, a negative coronavirus test will do. Similar scenes in Spain. The government there says it hopes to reopen the entire country from next month. Baby steps, I think it's fair to say. Countries obviously keen to get those tourists back in the country, those businesses supported again, but with a heavy dose of caution, because many of those countries have seen what happens when they open too quickly. The second and third waves of COVID-19 hit Europe very, very hard. But there is growing hope, growing optimism that as the weather gets better and summer arrives, that tourists will start to be welcomed back again, particularly if they can show that they've been fully vaccinated.
All right, Trent, we leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on WION and all your inputs.
Thank you.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.